Within 48 hours, the video had been viewed by over 12 million people. But nobody was prepared for what the FBI found when they traced the money behind the lies. Brooklyn Matthews thought she was just defending her dead father's honor against high school bullies. But she'd actually stumbled into a corruption scandal that reached from Cedar Falls City Hall to the state capitol, involving embezzled military charity funds and a decades-long cover-up that made her family's tragedy part of someone else's profit margin. By the time the handcuffs started clicking, 3 adults would be in federal custody, and the 17-year-old girl they'd tried to destroy would be the reason their entire house of cards came crashing down. The attack itself lasted less than 90 seconds, but the investigation that followed would uncover financial crimes spanning 15 years and victim testimonies from 47 military families who'd been systematically targeted and silenced. What started as typical small-town bullying became a federal case study in how institutional corruption destroys the very people institutions claim to protect, and why sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is a teenager who refuses to stay quiet. Cedar Falls, Iowa had always prided itself on being the kind of place where neighbors still waved to each other, and Friday night football games drew half the town. Riverside High School, with its red brick facade and perfectly manicured lawn, looked like something straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. The school's trophy cases gleamed with decades of championship victories and college acceptance rates that made parents from Des Moines drive their kids 40 minutes each way for the privilege of a Riverside education. But beneath the polished surface lurked the same ugly truths that plagued schools across America, that money talked, that star athletes played by different rules, and that sometimes the very people meant to protect students were the ones enabling their destruction. Brooklyn Matthews had learned these harsh realities within her first week at Riverside. At 17, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd already survived more than most adults ever would. Her father, Staff Sergeant Michael Matthews, had been killed in Afghanistan when she was 14, leaving behind a Purple Heart and a family drowning in medical debt from his final months of care. Her mother, Linda, had worked 3 jobs to keep their heads above water before finally accepting her sister's offer to move in with them in Cedar Falls. The transition from military base life to small-town Iowa had been jarring. Brooklyn missed the diversity of base schools, where kids came from all backgrounds and moved frequently enough that being new wasn't a mark against you. At Riverside, families had roots going back generations, and social hierarchies were established in kindergarten and reinforced through high school graduation. Brooklyn's honey blonde hair, inherited from her Swedish grandmother, caught the light as she walked through Riverside's hallways that Tuesday morning. She'd always taken pride in her hair. It was one of the few things that reminded her of her father, who used to braid it every morning before school when she was little. The memory was precious, especially now that those moments felt like they belonged to someone else's life. She'd been at Riverside for exactly 3 weeks, long enough to identify the unspoken rules, but not long enough to navigate them successfully, long enough to notice how certain students moved through the halls like they owned them, how teachers' expressions changed when they looked at her secondhand clothes, how the guidance counselor's smile grew strained when discussing her unique circumstances. The warning signs had been there from day one, whispers that followed her down hallways, textbooks that mysteriously went missing from her locker, anonymous social media accounts that tagged her in posts about charity cases and military welfare families. She'd reported the incidents to Vice Principal Henderson, who'd listened with the expression of someone calculating lawsuit potential rather than student welfare. Teenagers can be cruel, Henderson had said, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. I'm sure they'll warm up to you once you've been here longer. Maybe try joining some activities? The drama club is always looking for new members. Brooklyn had bitten back her response. She couldn't afford drama club or any other activity that required fees, uniforms, or materials her mother's paycheck couldn't cover. Instead, she spent her free periods in the library, where the elderly librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had quietly begun saving the newest fiction releases for her and never asked why she always packed her own lunch. But Cody Richardson had noticed her anyway. Cody was everything small-town America loved to celebrate: 6'2", quarterback handsome, and blessed with the kind of easy charisma that made teachers excuse his mediocre grades and parents overlook his entitled attitude. His father owned Richardson Development, the construction company responsible for half the new subdivisions around Cedar Falls. His mother sat on the school board and chaired the annual fundraising gala that kept Riverside's programs funded and its reputation gleaming. More importantly, Cody had been Riverside's golden boy since elementary school. The kind of student who could do no wrong in the eyes of the adults who mattered. Teachers laughed at his inappropriate jokes. Coaches overlooked his temper tantrums. Administrators made his disciplinary problems disappear before they could affect his college prospects. The confrontation that would change everything began, like most high school dramas, over something seemingly trivial. Brooklyn had been assigned as Cody's lab partner in advanced chemistry, a pairing that Mrs. Rodriguez had hoped might encourage both students. Brooklyn needed the social connection, and Cody needed someone smart enough to pull his grade above the C- that threatened his college athletic scholarships. The project was worth 30% of their semester grade, a comprehensive analysis of water pollution in local Cedar River tributaries. For Brooklyn, it was a chance to excel at something she genuinely enjoyed. For Cody, it was an irritating obstacle to his real priorities of football practice and weekend parties. Their first meeting had gone predictably poorly. Brooklyn arrived at the library with detailed research notes and a timeline for completing their work. Cody showed up 20 minutes late, smelling like marijuana and clearly annoyed at being there. "Look, scholarship girl," he'd said, dropping into the chair across from her with deliberate carelessness. "I don't know how things worked at whatever base school you crawled out of, but here's how this is going to work. You do the research, write the report, and put both our names on it. I'll show up for the presentation and smile pretty. Everyone wins." Brooklyn had looked up from her notes, her green eyes steady and unimpressed. "Actually, here's how it's going to work. We're going to split the research 50-50, collaborate on the analysis, and both contribute to the presentation. You know, like partners." Cody's face had darkened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by girls, and certainly not by girls who didn't have the social capital to back up their defiance. "You think you're better than me?" he'd asked, leaning forward aggressively. "My family has been in Cedar Falls since before Iowa was a state. My great-grandfather built half this town, and you're what, some dead soldier's daughter living off government handouts?" The words had hit Brooklyn like physical blows, not because they weren't partially true, but because of the casual cruelty with which they were delivered. Around them, the library had gone quiet, other students sensing drama and pulling out phones to record. Brooklyn had taken a slow breath, channeling the composure her father had taught her during his most difficult days. "Yes," she'd said quietly, "I think I'm better than someone who uses his family's money to excuse his own mediocrity. And if you're not going to contribute to this project, I'll do it myself, and let Mrs. Rodriguez know why there's only one name on the final report." She'd gathered her materials and walked away, leaving Cody staring after her with a mixture of shock and fury. Around the library, phones captured his expression, and by dinner time, the video of their exchange was circulating through every social media platform Riverside students used. For most teenagers, the humiliation would have been punishment enough, but Cody Richardson had never learned to accept defeat gracefully, and Brooklyn Matthews had just publicly challenged the natural order of things in a way that couldn't be ignored or forgotten. The campaign against her began subtly. Her locker combination mysteriously changed overnight, forcing her to wait in line at the main office while late students pushed past her. Her carefully packed lunches disappeared from the cafeteria refrigerator, leaving her hungry and too proud to ask for help. Anonymous accounts began posting her home address and her mother's work schedule, along with helpful suggestions about what welfare families deserved. Mrs. Rodriguez, perhaps sensing the undercurrents, quietly reassigned lab partners, but the damage was done. Brooklyn had marked herself as someone who didn't know her place, and, in a school where social hierarchy was everything, that made her dangerous. The escalation came during third period on what would later be known throughout Cedar Falls as the Tuesday everything changed. Brooklyn had been walking to her AP literature class when she'd noticed the crowd gathered near the main entrance. Students pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the school's front steps. Phones raised, voices excited in the way that suggested something worth filming was about to happen. Brooklyn Matthews to the main office. "Please, came the announcement over the PA system. Brooklyn Matthews to the main office immediately. She'd felt her stomach drop. Her mother was working a double shift at the nursing home, and Brooklyn's first thought was that something had happened. An accident. An injury. Another tragedy. Her family couldn't afford to survive. She'd made her way through the crowd. Ignoring the whispers and pointed stares, some students stepped aside respectfully, recognizing genuine worry. Others smirked, clearly knowing something she didn't. The main office was empty except for Mrs. Peterson, the elderly secretary who'd always been kind to Brooklyn. "Oh, honey," she'd said, looking genuinely distressed. "Principal Morrison wants to see you in his office." "But Brooklyn, maybe you should know." She'd glanced around nervously. "There's been some kind of incident. People are saying things about your family, about your father. Terrible things." Brooklyn's hands had gone cold. "What kind of things?" Before Mrs. Peterson could answer, Principal Morrison's door opened. Dr. James Morrison was a thin, nervous man who'd spent his entire career avoiding conflict and controversy. His expression as he looked at Brooklyn was pained, like she was a problem he desperately wanted to make disappear. "Miss Matthews," he'd said, "please come in. We need to discuss some concerning allegations that have been brought to my attention." Brooklyn had followed him into the office, her mind racing. The space was designed to intimidate. Oversized desk, expensive diplomas, photographs of Morrison with state politicians and wealthy donors. She'd sat in the visitor's chair, feeling small and exposed under the fluorescent lights. "I've received some disturbing reports about your behavior." Morrison had begun, not meeting her eyes, specifically, allegations that you've been making inappropriate claims about your father's military service. Claims that some of our families find troubling. Brooklyn had stared at him in disbelief. "Inappropriate claims? My father died serving his country. What's inappropriate about that?" Morrison had pulled out a folder, his hands shaking slightly. "According to information I've received, your father's death was complicated. There are suggestions that he may have been involved in activities that reflect poorly on his service record, activities that, if true, would certainly explain your family's current financial difficulties." The room had spun around Brooklyn. "Who told you that? Who said those things about my father?" "That's not important," Morrison had said quickly. "What matters is that these allegations are causing disruption in our school community. Parents are concerned about the influence of families with questionable backgrounds on their children." Brooklyn had sat in stunned silence, trying to process what was happening. Someone had manufactured lies about her father, lies so vicious and specific that they'd reached the principal's office and been treated as credible. This wasn't random teenage cruelty anymore. This was character assassination. "I want to see whatever information you have," she'd said finally. "I want copies of these allegations and the names of whoever made them." Morrison had closed the folder quickly. "I'm afraid that's not possible. But Miss Matthews, I think it would be best for everyone if you considered transferring to a different school, somewhere with more appropriate resources for students in your situation." The words had hung in the air like poison. Brooklyn had realized, with crystalline clarity, that this was orchestrated. Someone had used their influence to plant lies about her family. Knowing that Morrison lacked the backbone to verify them, someone had calculated that the easiest way to remove her from Riverside was to make her remove herself. "No," she'd said, standing up. "I'm not transferring. I'm not running away. And I'm not going to let you or anyone else destroy my father's memory based on lies." She'd walked toward the door, but Morrison's next words stopped her cold. "Miss Matthews, if you insist on staying, I can't guarantee your safety. Students are very upset about these revelations. There may be consequences." Brooklyn had turned back to face him, and for a moment, Morrison had seen exactly what Staff Sergeant Michael Matthews had taught his daughter about standing your ground under fire. "Are you threatening me, Principal Morrison?" "I'm warning you," he'd replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some things are bigger than you understand. Some families have more influence than you realize. Walk away now, and no one gets hurt." Brooklyn had smiled then, a expression that held none of the warmth 17-year-olds were supposed to possess. "You're absolutely right. Some things are bigger than I understand, but I'm about to learn." She'd left the office to find the hallway empty except for maintenance staff. All the students were outside now. pressed against windows or gathered on the lawn. The excitement in the air was palpable. The kind of energy that preceded riots or revolutions. Brooklyn had pushed through the exit doors to find herself facing a semicircle of students led by Cody Richardson and his closest friends, Jake Morrison, the principal's son, Ashley Chen, whose mother was on the school board, and Marcus Webb, whose father owned the biggest car dealership in 3 counties. They weren't alone. At least 30 other students formed a wider circle. Phones raised. Live streams active. There she is. Cody had called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Cedar Falls' very own stolen valor princess. The crowd had shifted, creating a clear path between Brooklyn and the group. She'd realized with growing horror that this was a planned event, carefully orchestrated and timed for maximum visibility. Someone had leaked her meeting with Morrison. Someone had known exactly when she'd emerge from the building. "Having a nice conversation with your family's reputation?" Ashley had asked sweetly. "Funny how differently people see you when they know the truth about military welfare fraud." Brooklyn had felt the walls closing in. They weren't just attacking her anymore. They were attacking her father's memory, her family's sacrifice, everything she held sacred. And they were doing it publicly, performatively, with an audience that would spread their poison across social media before she could even respond. "My father was a hero," she'd said, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "He died defending the freedom that lets spoiled children like you spread lies without consequences." Cody had stepped forward, scissors appearing in his hand like magic. They were large fabric scissors, the kind used in art classes, their blades catching the October sunlight. "Heroes don't raise daughters who lie about their service," he'd said, moving closer. "Heroes don't leave their families on welfare, and heroes definitely don't need their daughters fighting their battles for them." The crowd had pressed closer, sensing climax. Phones captured every angle as Cody moved behind Brooklyn, his friends flanking her sides. She'd realized, with sick certainty, that they intended to physically humiliate her in front of dozens of witnesses, and no adult was anywhere to be seen. "You want to represent military families?" Cody had whispered in her ear, loud enough for the phones to pick up. "Let's see how well you represent them when you look the part." The scissors had opened with a metallic whisper that seemed to echo across the courtyard. Brooklyn had felt them close around her ponytail, felt the blade press against her scalp, felt the first few strands separate with sickening ease. That's when Officer Maria Santos, Cedar Falls Police Department, had turned the corner on her routine patrol of the school zone, and everything changed forever. Officer Maria Santos had been patrolling Cedar Falls school zones for 8 years, long enough to distinguish between harmless teenage drama and genuine threats. What she saw as she rounded the corner of Riverside High School's main entrance made her blood run cold, and her hand instinctively moved toward her radio. A 17-year-old girl stood surrounded by at least 30 students, their phones raised like weapons, while a young man held fabric scissors dangerously close to her head. The girl's posture screamed trapped animal, tense, alert, but trying desperately to maintain dignity in the face of public humiliation. The boy with the scissors wore the expression Santos recognized from domestic violence calls, predatory satisfaction mixed with entitled rage. But it was the complete absence of adult supervision that made Santos slam her patrol car into park and stride across the courtyard with the kind of authority that could silence riots. "Cedar Falls Police Department," she called out, her voice cutting through the excited chatter like a blade. Everyone stepped back from the young lady. Now, the crowd scattered like startled birds, but Cody Richardson held his position behind Brooklyn, the scissors still tangled in her hair. His crew, Jake Morrison, Ashley Chen, and Marcus Webb, formed a protective semicircle around him, their expensive phones still recording. "Officer, this is just a misunderstanding," Ashley called out sweetly, her cheerleader smile never wavering. "We were just having some fun with our friend here. You know how teenagers are." Santos approached slowly, her 20 years of police experience reading the scene like a textbook, the victim's rigid posture, the aggressor's defensive stance, the way bystanders were positioned for optimal filming angles. This wasn't spontaneous teenage mischief. This was orchestrated harassment, and someone had planned it carefully. "Son," Santos addressed Cody directly, her voice carrying the kind of calm that experienced officers use to de-escalate dangerous situations. "I need you to put those scissors down and step away from the young lady. Right now." Cody's blue eyes flickered with calculation. His father had donated heavily to the police department's youth programs. His mother served on the city council alongside the police chief's wife. In his world, authority figures were allies, not obstacles. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, flashing the same charismatic smile that had gotten him out of trouble since elementary school. "This is Brooklyn Matthews. She's been spreading lies about military families, including her own father. We were just trying to help her understand how her behavior affects our community." Santos felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd heard variations of this excuse before, the kind of victim blaming that turned assault into community service, harassment into moral instruction. But there was something else in the boy's tone, a rehearsed quality that suggested he'd been coached on exactly what to say if caught. "Put the scissors down," Santos repeated, her hand moving visibly to her radio. "This is not a request." For a moment, the courtyard held its breath. Cody's grip on the scissors tightened, and Brooklyn tensed as the blades pressed closer to her scalp. Santos recognized the moment when perpetrators decided whether to escalate or retreat, and she prepared for either outcome. Then Principal Morrison appeared in the doorway, his face flushed and panicked. "Officer Santos, I'm sure we can handle this internally. These are good kids from good families. I'm certain this is just a misunderstanding that got out of hand." Santos kept her eyes on Cody while addressing Morrison. "Principal, I'm going to need you to step back and let me handle this situation. And I'm going to need all these students to stop filming and disperse immediately. You can't make us stop recording," Jake Morrison called out, his father's authority bleeding into his voice. "This is a public space. We have First Amendment rights." Santos finally looked directly at the principal's son, noting the family resemblance in both features and entitled attitude. "Son, you're absolutely right about the First Amendment. You also have the right to remain silent, which I strongly suggest you exercise before you talk yourself into an obstruction charge." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Several students lowered their phones, but many others kept recording, sensing that they were witnessing something bigger than typical school drama. "Cody," Brooklyn said quietly, her voice steady, despite the scissors still tangled in her hair. "Officer Santos is giving you a chance to walk away from this. I'd take it if I were you." Something in her tone made Cody pause. There was no fear in her words, no pleading or desperation. Instead, there was a calm certainty that suggested she knew something he didn't. For the first time since the confrontation began, doubt flickered across his features. Santos used the moment to step closer. "Son, you have exactly 5 seconds to release those scissors and step away from Miss Matthews. 1, 2. Cody's hand opened, and the scissors clattered to the concrete steps with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire courtyard. He stepped back, his face cycling through emotions as the reality of his situation began to sink in. "Smart choice," Santos said, moving between Cody and Brooklyn. "Now, Miss Matthews, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Brooklyn reached up to touch her hair, finding the ragged strands where the scissors had begun their work. About 3 inches of her ponytail hung loose, partially severed but still attached. Her hands were shaking, now that the immediate danger had passed, but her voice remained steady. "I'm not hurt," she said. "But Officer Santos, this isn't random bullying. This was planned. They've been systematically targeting me and my family for weeks, spreading lies about my father's military service, trying to force me to transfer schools." Santos pulled out her notebook, her expression growing more serious with each detail. "What kind of lies?" "Miss Matthews, they're claiming my father was involved in some kind of military fraud, that he died under suspicious circumstances, that my family has been living off stolen military benefits." Brooklyn's voice cracked slightly on the last words. "My father died a hero in Afghanistan. He earned a Purple Heart." But somehow these stories about financial crimes reached Principal Morrison, who called me to his office this morning and suggested I transfer schools for everyone's safety. Santos looked up from her notebook, her eyes finding Morrison in the crowd. The principal had gone pale, his hands fidgeting with his tie in a gesture that screamed, "Guilty conscience." Principal Morrison. I'm going to need to speak with you about this meeting. But first, I need to secure this scene and get statements from all involved parties. Officer, surely we can handle this matter internally, Morrison said, his voice pitching higher with desperation. There's no need to involve law enforcement in what amounts to a teenage disagreement. Principal. The moment someone brought out a weapon and physically restrained a student, this became a law enforcement matter. Santos replied firmly, and frankly, the allegations Miss Matthews is describing sound like harassment, defamation, and possibly conspiracy. She turned to address the crowd of students, many of whom were still filming. Everyone who recorded any part of this incident needs to preserve that footage. Do not delete anything. This is now part of an active investigation. Ashley Chen stepped forward, her cheerleader confidence wavering for the first time. Officer, you're making this sound way more serious than it is. We were just trying to help Brooklyn understand that her stories about her family were hurting people in our community. Military families deserve respect. And when someone lies about their service, it dishonors everyone. Santos stared at Ashley for a long moment, recognizing the kind of manipulative rhetoric that turned victims into villains and attackers into heroes. Miss Chen, are you claiming that Miss Matthews has been lying about her father's military service? Well, not lying exactly. Ashley backpedaled, suddenly aware that she was being recorded by both official and unofficial sources. But there have been questions raised about certain financial irregularities. And some people think, what people? Santos interrupted. Who specifically raised these questions, and what evidence do they have to support their claims? Ashley's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. Around her, the other students began to shift uncomfortably, realizing that their carefully constructed narrative was falling apart under professional scrutiny. Santos made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire investigation. Instead of treating this as a simple assault case, she began treating it as what it actually was, a systematic harassment campaign with potentially criminal coordination. Miss Matthews, I'm going to need you to come with me to the station to give a detailed statement. Principal Morrison, I'll need to see any documentation related to the allegations against Miss Matthews's family, and I'm going to need the names and contact information for everyone who was involved in spreading these stories. Morrison's face went from pale to gray. Officer, I'm not sure I can release that information without proper warrants and… Principal. Miss Matthews is a minor who was just physically assaulted on school property while you were in your office. Unless you want to explain to the State Department of Education and the local news why you failed to protect a student under your care, I suggest you start cooperating. The threat of media attention had an immediate effect. Morrison nodded quickly, his hands still fidgeting with his tie. Of course, Officer Santos, we want to cooperate fully with your investigation. Santos turned to Cody and his crew, noting how their confident demeanor had evaporated in the face of actual consequences. Mr. Richardson, Mr. Morrison, Miss Chen, Mr. Webb, you're all going to need to come to the station as well. We'll be conducting formal interviews about this incident and the events leading up to it. You can't just arrest us. Marcus Webb protested, his father's car dealership empire apparently not providing immunity from police investigations. We have rights. We have lawyers. You absolutely have rights, Mr. Webb, and you absolutely should call your lawyers, because what happened here today isn't going away with daddy's donations or family connections. Santos radioed for backup, knowing that transporting multiple minors and securing evidence would require additional officers. While they waited, she continued gathering preliminary information, taking photos of Brooklyn's partially severed hair, the scissors on the ground, and the positioning of everyone involved. But it was when she started asking for the students' phones that the real panic began. I need everyone who was filming to unlock their devices so we can preserve the evidence, Santos announced. You can't just take our phones, Jake Morrison said, clutching his iPhone like a lifeline. That's illegal search and seizure. Santos smiled grimly. Son, when you film a crime in progress, that footage becomes evidence. I can either take your phones now with your cooperation, or I can get a warrant and take them later, along with every electronic device in your house. Your choice. One by one. The students reluctantly handed over their devices. But it was Ashley Chen's panicked expression that caught Santos's attention. "Miss Chen, is there something on your phone you don't want us to see?" Ashley's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "It's not what you think. We were trying to protect the community. Military families have suffered enough without people lying about their service. So you decided to take justice into your own hands? We had evidence," Ashley said desperately. "Real evidence about financial crimes. Someone gave us documents that proved—" "Ashley, shut up," Cody snapped. But it was too late. Santos had heard the magic words that transformed a school bullying incident into a potential federal case. "Someone gave you documents? What kind of documents? And who gave them to you?" Ashley looked around frantically, realizing she'd said too much. I can't. My mom said I shouldn't talk about it without a lawyer." Santos felt the familiar tingle that came with major case breaks. "Miss Chen, your mother knew about these documents?" Before Ashley could answer, backup units arrived, and the scene transformed into a proper crime scene investigation. Officers began interviewing witnesses, collecting evidence, and separating the various parties involved. But it was Detective Ray Thompson, a 25-year veteran with the Cedar Falls Police Department, who made the connection that would blow the case wide open. Thompson had been assigned to follow up on the documentation Principal Morrison provided about the allegations against Brooklyn's family. What he found in the school's files made his blood run cold. The documents were professionally prepared, printed on official-looking letterhead, and contained detailed financial information that no high school student should have access to. They alleged that Staff Sergeant Michael Matthews had been involved in a charity fraud scheme, that his death benefits had been illegally obtained, and that his family continued to receive fraudulent payments. But when Thompson ran the information through military databases, he discovered something that changed everything. The allegations weren't just false, they were identical to claims that had been made against 12 other military families in 3 different Iowa counties over the past 5 years. Detective Thompson immediately contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and the military's Criminal Investigation Command. By evening, what had started as a school bullying incident had become a multi-jurisdictional investigation into systematic fraud targeting military families. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh arrived in Cedar Falls the next morning with a team of federal investigators and a file that painted a picture of corruption so extensive it took Brooklyn's breath away. "Miss Matthews," Agent Walsh said as they sat in the police station's conference room, "your father wasn't the target of random teenage cruelty. He was the victim of an organized criminal enterprise that has been targeting military families for years." Walsh spread documents across the table, financial records, insurance claims, charity applications, all bearing the names of families Brooklyn had never heard of but whose stories were heartbreakingly familiar. "The pattern is always the same," Walsh explained. "A military family suffers a tragedy, death, injury, deploiement stress. Local charities and support organizations rally around them. Then, mysteriously, allegations surface about financial impropriety. The families become pariahs in their communities, lose their support networks, and eventually leave town. Meanwhile, the money that was raised for their support disappears into accounts controlled by the very people who were supposed to help them." Brooklyn stared at the documents, trying to process the scope of what Walsh was describing. "You're saying someone has been stealing from military families and then destroying their reputations to cover it up?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. And Miss Matthews, your family wasn't chosen randomly. Your father's death benefits, combined with the charity money raised by Cedar Falls community groups, represented over $300,000. Money that never reached your family." The room spun around Brooklyn. $300,000. Her mother working 3 jobs. Their apartment with its broken heater and outdated appliances. The nights Brooklyn had gone to bed hungry because there wasn't enough food, all while someone in Cedar Falls had been living off money meant for her family. "Who?" Brooklyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who stole from us?" Agent Walsh pulled out another file, this one marked with federal case numbers and classified stamps. "That's what we're here to find out. But based on the documents your classmates had access to, and the level of coordination required to execute this fraud, we're looking at multiple conspirators in positions of significant authority." Over the next week, the investigation unfolded like a nightmare that explained every cruel moment Brooklyn had endured since arriving in Cedar Falls. Federal agents interviewed every student involved in the harassment campaign, traced the source of the fraudulent documents, and followed money trails that led directly to some of Cedar Falls' most respected citizens. The first arrest came on Thursday morning. Margaret Chen, Ashley's mother and longtime Cedar Falls City Council member, was taken into custody at her real estate office on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit theft from military families. The evidence against her was overwhelming. For 8 years, Margaret Chen had been using her position on various charity boards to divert funds meant for military families into accounts she controlled. When families began asking questions about missing money, she would plant allegations of fraud against them, using her political connections to spread the lies and force the families to leave town before they could pursue legal action. The second arrest followed within hours. Dr. Harold Webb, Marcus's father and owner of Webb Auto Group, had been laundering the stolen money through fake car sales and inflated charity donations. His dealership's books revealed a complex web of financial crimes that had netted him over $2 million in stolen military family support funds. But it was the third arrest that shattered Cedar Falls' carefully maintained facade of small-town innocence. Principal James Morrison was arrested at his home Friday morning, charged with conspiracy, fraud, and violation of federal civil rights laws. The investigation revealed that Morrison had been Margaret Chen's inside source at the school district, providing student records and family financial information that enabled the targeting of vulnerable military families. Morrison's computer contained years of correspondence with Chen, Webb, and others, detailing how they identified potential victims, fabricated evidence against them, and coordinated community harassment campaigns to drive families away before investigations could expose their crimes. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Over 15 years, the group had systematically targeted 47 military families across 3 counties, stealing an estimated $4.2 million in charity funds, death benefits, and community donations. But perhaps most chilling was the discovery of what they called the manual, a detailed playbook for destroying military families that included psychological manipulation tactics, legal intimidation strategies, and community isolation techniques. Brooklyn read excerpts of the manual in Agent Walsh's office, her hands shaking as she recognized her own experience in its clinical descriptions. Phase 1. Establish credibility through community involvement and charitable giving. Phase 2. Identify vulnerable military families through school records, charity applications, and community networks. Phase 3. Divert funds through legitimate, appearing transactions and accounting manipulations. Phase 4. Plant allegations of impropriety when families begin asking questions. Phase 5. Coordinate community harassment to force family relocation before exposure. "This is what they did to us," Brooklyn said, her voice hollow with realization. "Everything that happened, the lies about my father, the school meeting, the public humiliation, it was all from their playbook." Agent Walsh nodded grimly. "Your family was targeted the moment you moved to Cedar Falls. Miss Matthews, Margaret Chen saw your father's death benefits and the community donations raised for your family, and she marked you for theft. The harassment campaign was designed to drive you away before you could discover that the money never reached your family." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when investigators traced the source of the documents Cody Richardson and his friends had used to justify their attack on Brooklyn. The fraudulent military records had been created by Richard Richardson, Cody's father, who had used his construction company's connections with government contractors to access and falsify official documents. Richardson's arrest made national news. The CEO of a major construction company, a pillar of the Cedar Falls community, a man whose charitable donations had funded everything from Little League fields to senior centers, led away in handcuffs, while FBI agents seized millions of dollars in assets purchased with stolen military family support funds. But the most satisfying moment for Brooklyn came when Agent Walsh showed her the final piece of evidence that had sealed the case against all conspirators. The video footage from Ashley Chen's phone. "Your classmates recorded everything," Walsh explained, playing the video on her laptop. "Not just the assault, but the planning meetings, the coordination with their parents. even discussions about how to dispose of evidence if they got caught. On the screen, Brooklyn watched Ashley Chen explaining to her friends how her mother had provided the evidence against Brooklyn's family, how they needed to make the harassment look spontaneous rather than coordinated, how their parents had promised to protect them from any consequences. The video was devastating evidence of premeditation, coordination, and criminal conspiracy. More importantly, it captured the conspirators, admitting that they knew the allegations against Brooklyn's father were false. "We know she's innocent," Ashley's voice said from the laptop speakers. "But Mom says sometimes you have to destroy innocent people to protect the community. Military families are always taking money they don't deserve anyway." Brooklyn felt sick hearing the casual cruelty in Ashley's voice, the way she dismissed her family's suffering as necessary collateral damage, but she also felt vindicated. The truth was finally coming out, and her father's reputation would be restored. The trials began 6 months later and lasted through the summer. Brooklyn testified as the prosecution's star witness, her composure and dignity on the stand contrasting sharply with the desperate attempts of the defendants to minimize their crimes. Margaret Chen's defense attorney tried to paint her as a concerned citizen who had acted to protect community resources from fraudulent claims. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before convicting her on all counts. Dr. Webb attempted to claim ignorance of the conspiracy, insisting he had believed the allegations against military families were legitimate. Financial records showing his lavish lifestyle funded by stolen charity money undermined his credibility completely. Principal Morrison broke down on the witness stand, admitting his role in the conspiracy, but claiming he had been pressured into cooperation by more powerful conspirators. His plea for mercy fell on deaf ears when prosecutors revealed that he had personally profited from every military family forced to leave his school district. Richardson fought the charges aggressively, hiring a team of expensive lawyers and claiming that his document falsification was a patriotic effort to expose military fraud. The mountain of evidence against him, combined with victim impact statements from 47 military families, led to his conviction on all federal charges. But it was Cody Richardson's sentencing that provided the most dramatic conclusion to the case. At Austin, Cody was tried as an adult for assault, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. His defense team argued that he had been manipulated by adults into believing he was serving his community by attacking Brooklyn. Brooklyn testified at his sentencing hearing, looking directly at the young man who had tried to humiliate her with scissors and lies. "Cody Richardson knew my father had died serving his country," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "He knew the allegations against my family were lies. He chose to participate in a criminal conspiracy because he believed his family's money would protect him from consequences. Today, he learns that in America, justice doesn't have a price tag." Cody was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. His college football scholarship was revoked. His admission to Northwestern University was rescinded, and his father's construction empire collapsed under the weight of federal seizure orders. Ashley Chen, Jake Morrison, and Marcus Webb received lighter sentences as minors, but all were required to complete extensive community service with military support organizations and were barred from attending any college that received federal funding. The financial restitution ordered by the federal court was staggering. Over $6 million in assets were seized from the conspirators and distributed to the 47 military families they had victimized. Brooklyn's family received not only the money originally stolen from them, but additional damages for the emotional trauma and reputation destruction they had suffered. But for Brooklyn, the money was less important than the restoration of her father's honor and the knowledge that no other military family would suffer the same fate in Cedar Falls. The broader impact of the case reverberated far beyond Cedar Falls. The FBI investigation had uncovered similar fraud schemes in 12 other states, leading to a nationwide crackdown on charity fraud targeting military families. Brooklyn became a reluctant symbol of resistance against institutional corruption, speaking at military bases and veterans organizations about the importance of standing up to systematic abuse. Her story inspired new federal legislation requiring oversight of military family support funds and criminal background checks for charity organization leaders. Cedar Falls itself underwent a transformation that residents would talk about for generations. The corruption scandal had exposed the rot beneath the town's polished surface, forcing a reckoning with systems that had protected predators and silenced victims for decades. Riverside High School received a new principal, new policies requiring immediate police involvement in harassment cases, and a memorial garden dedicated to military families, funded by money recovered from the conspiracy. Brooklyn finished her senior year at Riverside as class valedictorian, her academic excellence no longer overshadowed by lies and harassment. Her graduation speech, delivered to a crowd that included FBI agents, military officials, and families from across the country who had been inspired by her courage, became a viral sensation that was viewed by millions. "They tried to cut my hair to cut me down to size," she said, standing at the podium where Principal Morrison had once tried to force her to transfer schools, but they only succeeded in showing me how much strength I had inherited from my father. Staff Sergeant Michael Matthews taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to fight for what's right, even when you're afraid. Brooklyn accepted a full scholarship to the United States Military Academy at West Point, following in her father's footsteps while forging her own path toward a career in military law and veterans advocacy. 5 years later, Captain Brooklyn Matthews would return to Cedar Falls for the dedication of the Michael Matthews Memorial Foundation, a nationwide organization that provides legal advocacy and financial oversight for military families facing charity fraud. Standing in the same courtyard where Cody Richardson had once held scissors to her head, Brooklyn looked out at an audience that included former enemies who had found redemption, community leaders working to rebuild trust, and military families who had found hope in her story. "My father died believing that America was worth defending," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet strength that had faced down bullies and criminals. "What I learned in Cedar Falls is that America is worth defending not just from foreign enemies, but from the corruption that rots our communities from within. Every time we stand up to injustice, every time we refuse to let the powerful prey on the vulnerable, every time we choose truth over convenience, we honor the sacrifice of every person who ever wore our nation's uniform." The applause that followed echoed across Cedar Falls like thunder, a sound that drowned out the memory of cruel laughter and restored dignity to a place that had nearly lost its soul to greed and corruption. Brooklyn Matthews had arrived in Cedar Falls as a vulnerable military daughter trying to rebuild her life after tragedy. She left as a force of nature who had torn down a criminal empire and rebuilt a community's moral foundation. The scissors that were meant to humiliate her had instead cut away the lies that protected predators, revealing the truth that set dozens of families free and ensured that her father's sacrifice would never be dishonored again. In the end, justice in Cedar Falls hadn't just been served. It had been delivered with the precision of a perfectly executed military operation, led by a 17-year-old girl who refused to let anyone define her worth or destroy her father's legacy. The bullies had indeed messed with the wrong girl, but more than that, they had chosen the wrong country to commit their crimes in, because in America, sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. And sometimes justice arrives exactly when heroes need it most.